Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for joining us today on our webinar on how to automate complex invoices. I'm going to wait a moment or two before we kick off just to give people to get settled and logged in. There's a few more attendees I can see joining, so we'll start in about a minute or so and get things underway then. Okay, I think we'll get underway. I can see a few more people have joined us here, so thank you again for joining us on today's session. Just to introduce myself, my name is Gareth Pearce. I head up the pre-sales team in SoftCo. I've been working in AP for over 20 years, so hoping to share some of my experience with you today. And I'll let my colleague, Cillian McCarthy, introduce himself.
Hi guys, thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, as Gareth said, wherever you're joining from. Thank you for coming along to the webinar today. We just want to discuss some of our experience in the PO, non-PO world of AP automation, and I'm head of sales or sales director here in SoftCo for the last number of years, been in the AP P2P space for over 20 years. So delighted to get this opportunity to talk you through some practical real world examples.
Okay, so the agenda for today is really quite simple. What we said we're going to do is discuss or explain how we believe you can best automate complex invoices. So we'll start by just giving you some of the areas that we see that lead to complexity in invoice processing in the accounts payable world. We'll talk a bit about that. And then really get into the detail of how AP automation in general, and also with the advent of AI, it's shifted everything significantly in terms of what it can do. So I think what we're hoping to do is give you a sense of all the different areas where an AP solution, and we're not just talking about SoftCo, we're just talking in general, can really help with automating what are typically manual processes or semi-manual processes, or maybe even ones that you're trying to automate at the moment but not getting the results that you expect. So we'll give you an overview or insight into some of the things that you can that are achievable with AP automation and AI. So I'm going to start by maybe just getting Cillian to talk a little bit about what do we mean by complexity? What are the different aspects of the accounts payable process that lead to difficult, manual, complex, hard to manage processes? So Cillian, maybe if you could just give people an overview where you see complexity in the processing of invoices.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gareth, for the introduction. Look, I suppose there's the challenge with AP since COVID and the advent of COVID is that, and it still exists very much in many companies where invoices are being received manually, but probably since COVID there has been a huge shift towards email. So probably 80% of invoices, if not higher, are now currently all being received by email. And that has also, I suppose, created there's an awful lot of working from home environment in the finance space at the moment. So people have remote locations and documents being received possibly distributed or centrally. So if you've got a distributed model, allocating workload and having visibility of the AP team workload can be difficult when you see how you can receive the invoice in multiple different formats. So like we'll talk about it later on, but there is other things about, so paper copy that can be scanned and emailed, physical copy or emailed copy coming in with PDFs natively. And particularly in Europe, there's a huge push towards e-invoicing. We just had Belgium go live in mandates. There's Poland has gone live in February, and the back end of this year, February, or France is coming online in September. And other countries are planning significant change and shift in that over the next 3-4 years. So that's bringing unrest, concern, and management of all these different types of invoice formats can present challenges. But ultimately, from an AP team perspective, that you want one unified system to be able to see all workloads and so that you can allocate and manage. Validating invoices, I just spoke about e-invoicing. So e-invoicing can be very simple, but it can also create some complexity around the different e-invoice formats, the different government portals you need to integrate with to make sure that it's a valid e-invoice. But you can come back to simpler levels like in PDF, where is it a valid document? Is it not? Is it AI generated? Is there secure signatures on the PDF? Is it that people are very, very concerned about fraud? And then it kind of leads us on to our other point of what's on the invoice that we want to be sure of. So is it a valid active vendor in your vendor master file? Are the bank details on the invoice as you expect as per your master vendor file? And do you believe this invoice should be processed? People are really pushing towards the PO environment to put some structure and remove concern around the whole AP process. So your P2P, procure to pay maturity needs to become more and more advanced in relation to having better PO process, better supplier onboarding. So when we do come to process an invoice, the vendor info is absolutely sacrosanct and validated, and the bank details that are associated with that are very clear. More and more invoices, people are having multi-page invoices, multi-line invoices. So the volume of data on invoice can make it complex to process. So if you've got single line, multi-line, but one of the most common scenarios that we would often be asked about is, I'm very happy with a single invoice, one line PO. But what happens if I have a situation where I have 20 lines on an invoice, all referencing different POs and corresponding year ends? And that creates issues in terms of matching, creates issues in terms of figuring out where the issues are in terms of going back to the corresponding GRNs and various things. I just referenced it there in terms of price and quantity with multi-lines that can take issues. How an invoice should be coded. So this can be very simple. Could be a utility bill that goes to utilities, electricity as a GL, and the cost center could be the department location for that store or site. But it could also be, and we're seeing it quite a lot now, with a lot of invoices where there's surcharges on invoices, particularly in the US, or there's delivery charges. So even though it's a PO driven invoice, there will be a surcharge on the bottom of the invoice that's not factored into the PO. And how do you want to code and distribute that cost? So that again can be create challenges and time to process on behalf of an AP team. So in terms of how charges should be validated, there's pricing on the PO, there's invoice schedules, there's freight surcharges I mentioned, but invoicing schedules could be that I have a drawdown PO and I need to bill for a construction site and part payments. I will have quarterly payments or monthly payments. So they need to be cross-referenced against that. And some of these things are done in a manual world in different places where people are looking up other spreadsheets in different places. So our goal with any of this is try to centralize and make the process very clean for the AP team and ultimately make the invoice processing time as simple and as effective as possible. And I think in the last couple of years, we've had an awful lot of mergers and acquisitions in the construction trade. There's been an awful lot of suppliers being merging and various different things. And what that does is create multiple locations, multiple sites. Manufacturing sites are getting bigger. There's a huge European and US crossover. We have companies and customers who have offices in and locations in the Philippines, in the US, in Europe. We've one client who has probably 70 different locations all across Europe. And then we have others that have 300 different locations across Europe. So when you have issues with invoices like that, you may have to go to a site manager, you may have to go to an area manager, and that can be done manually by email or with solutions in like AP automation. It can be very much driven based on past behavior, learned behavior, But if from an AP perspective, that can be a difficult thing to manage and challenge.
Okay, yeah, great. So I think, or I hope a lot of those scenarios are relevant to our people who are joining us today, that you recognize yourself in some of those scenarios. We did just expand a bit. I think we probably talked to these points already in terms of the complexity about how the invoice is received. You've already talked about the different channels. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to add around that specifically, Cillian, or will I move on?
No, I think the main thing is that if you're considering AP automation, there is solutions there that can handle all channels and give you a single view of the world. And there is also a huge amount of upside to be got in terms of invoices coming into email or coming from the EDI networks or e-invoicing. They all, there's an awful lot of manual steps that can be removed, and you can give an awful lot of comfort to the AP team that you're processing the correct document with technology and that you're not going down a rabbit hole looking at a fraudulent invoice. So absolutely get the inbound process correct, and also give yourself the best chance of processing these in the most efficient way, and there is tools to help you with that.
And then obviously, I think a lot of companies use purchase orders, but again, there can be different scenarios around what they're using the purchases for, and that I think can present different challenges. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, listen, with POs, I think if you step back and look at every business, and if you look at every manufacturing business or any, so just take manufacturing or retail as an example. If they were doing 100,000 invoices as an organization, usually what you would see is your goods for resale, or people call it their stock invoices, good for resale, goods for um, all your goods invoices for manufacturing or materials. They usually equate to somewhere in the region of 65 to 80% of the volume. And they always have a very strict, stringent process because the cost of those materials can be very, very high. It is a high lead time. That's their core business. So ordering those goods in the PO and the goods receipt process around those are very stringent, and everyone understands because you've got warehouse management systems, high levels of stock, very high investment in terms of buying the stock and turning it over to make a profit as it is their core business. Um, the operational spend, or people refer to it as OPEX, goods not for resale, GNFR, there's many different terminologies in the industry, but ultimately it's the spend to run the business. So your legal, your IT, your marketing, your utilities, that can often be the poor relation in terms of POs being created, and suffers quite a bit sometimes from retrospective POs.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is an invoice will come and people realize it does need a PO. They will route the invoice to the correct business user, who then raises the PO once they've received the invoice.
Essentially
That's
defeating the
probably,
purpose.
yeah, and that's a very huge inhibitor to automation, because when you ask people, do they have, what percentage of invoices that they have with POs, they often give you a very high number, like 70, 80%. But when you actually drill into it, it might be 40, 50 with 30% retrospective. And that's a huge inhibitor to automation because we can't match against the PO. And there's a very simple analogy with invoice processing to keep the touches low. So if we've received an invoice with no PO, then we send it back to the business to create the PO. Invariably, it might be somebody else who has to do the goods receipt. So they won't have done the goods receipt. That's another touch point. And in all the while, AP are sitting in the middle waiting for this PO to be approved and the goods receipt to be approved. And they're just the practical realities of retrospective POs causing us a delay in the invoice approval process. And you've said it there on the right hand side. Now you're into, that's before we even get into the matching issues of line item matching, deliveries, goods receipts we just referenced, blanket or drawdown budgets. So there's challenges with those as well, and people are setting up POs incorrectly. So in the last couple of days, I've done a number of different calls with prospects and customers where when you look at the PO analysis, they're raising the PO of a quantity of 1 and a price 1,000, but that's a very difficult thing to goods receipt. So then what they do is they create the price or quantity 1,000 and price 1, so that they can goods receipt partially the values. But sometimes the goods receipt process can create more havoc because it's giving partial receipts, partial deliveries, and the invoice values don't match. So you have it there, partial matching, where some line items and others need investigation. It's difficult when you have multiple decimal places and all of that. It creates a lot of headache for the AP person. It's hard to decipher where the actual problem is.
Okay, I think there's looking at the non-PO side, and I don't want to spend necessarily go into all the detail in terms of the problems, because I think we'll probably address some of them, but there are a lot of invoices that we see our customers or prospective customers looking to process that don't have a PO. The PO doesn't fit naturally.
Yeah.
And it's, I suppose, categorizing them and the challenges that typically come with them as well.
Do you want to talk through, I suppose, recurring charges? I think,
yeah,
and equipment leases, I suppose, there, and going back to the operational spend, naturally they would fall possibly into a non-PO process. And I think when you have a non-PO process for these, people have, so you typically don't get an invoice for rent. Even if you're renting a facility or a building, you will always just be expected to pay the charge of $3,000 or €2,000 a month, whatever the fee might be. And as a result, people are managing some of those costs offline on spreadsheets or different accrual processes. So when an invoice comes in, the invoice gets paid, and then they're retrospective cross-referencing on those journals or payment processes to say, have we got all the corresponding invoices? So there's definitely a lot of ways that you can improve that. So there is the concept of, in certain applications called contract POs or recurring POs, equipment leases. Again, it's a fixed charge. There's a lot of company cars. There's a lot of manufacturing companies would have equipment leases, like on machinery, forklifts, various different things of machinery, or that they will have a fixed charge every month, and they expect to get a bill for that, but they also are expected to pay it. And that can create some frustration sometimes in the AP team, that they're handling the same invoice all the time, but also it may be that there's an invoice has come in for a fixed charge of 500 per month for a piece of machinery, but the person in the business is being asked to confirm and sign off that every month, where ultimately all they would really like to do is see if the company has billed over the 500. So if it's within the 500 tolerance, just pay it. If it's outside of that, that we should look at sending it to the relevant person to confirm why it might be that, and it might be needed additional service equipment or something broke on it, and whether that's covered. But all of these things can create manual overhead. And I think what we're trying to do is, with the occasional non-recurring stuff there, as you said, they require manual coding, needs to go to the right person, can be unclear. They're difficult to decipher what needs to happen. The stuff on the left-hand side are very much ripe for automation and very much ripe for structure, because they're repeatable, structured processes, and we know the behavior and we can forecast how things should be done against them.
Okay, I think this is in some ways kind of summarizes some of what we said. There's other things there as well, in terms of, you mentioned it at the start, other areas that need to be validated. It's not just about necessarily approving the invoice and coding it. There's other things going on there that lead to complexity. There's the vendor and bank account validation, which you've mentioned. Sometimes large volume invoices can be really challenging. And I think the other stuff you probably touched on already, in terms of getting it coded, getting it on the appropriate approval route. So
yeah, I think just to pick up on one point there. As you know, we're working with a couple of different international providers verifying the bank details. And I think more and more people are concerned about the fraudulent invoices. I think this 5 years ago, if we asked many of our customers, would they been subjected to any fraud or at risk of fraud that they were aware of, they wouldn't have said if you did a poll of 100 customers, you'd probably get 30 saying, yeah, no, we've had being exposed to it, or we were at risk to it, or we potentially got caught from it. I think if you were to ask that poll now, that would go to 85 out of 100 saying it's ripe, and they're putting in an awful lot more manual checks in places. And one of the things that I know we're actively doing, and it's quite valid, is that at any given point in time, we can invoke the bank details check. So literally the name on the account is valid to the name that we've set up, and that can be real-time web call and process. And that's giving people huge comfort, because the alternative to that is doing callbacks and recording the callback that we're verifying that. So there's a lot of manual processes being put in place in places to give comfort and verification that they're doing the right thing. But there's also exceptional technology there to do all that for you, and it's coming into the banking sector and financial services, and we can utilize it and take advantage of it. So it should be considered across the AP process as well.
Okay, so that's kind of framing, I suppose, the challenges. And again, we're going to kind of keep it very kind of conversational, but what we're going to look to do now is just look at areas where there's solutions out there, the technology out there is able to do things that maybe you weren't even aware that it could be done, or just explain a bit more about what can be done. So I'm going to step you through each of these, and maybe, Cillian, I might just kind of summarize what they are, and maybe if you want to add in anything that I haven't covered. But I was going to start with receiving the invoices. As I said, obviously in the likes of Europe and Asia and South America, there's a lot of e-invoicing, so they're coming through e-invoice networks, but still the fact is the vast majority of invoices processed are still PDFs coming in very often to an email inbox. That creates its own challenges there, and there's now, again, AI assisted, AI leading the charge, but you now have the means of automatically managing your AP inbox in terms of, first of all, isolating those invoices that have been sent into your general AP inbox. So you might have a general inbox where you're receiving your queries, your statements, your invoices. First thing automation can do is identify which of those emails have invoices in them and send them off for processing. But also with those other emails, whether they be queries, whether they be statements, that with the help of AI, they can be automatically classified and sent on their own particular route for processing, or even to the point now where with LLM that they can help generate responses to queries on invoice status, things like that, things that can take up a large proportion of your AP personnel's time. These can all be automated to a very high degree. That fair to say, or anything to add on that?
No, absolutely. I think that's, and look, it's the strides made in that space in the last 3 to 5 years have been huge, and I think it's only going to improve, as you said there, with the LLM and the automatic query responses and systems being able to integrate with APIs to very different applications. The receipt of the invoice into the mailbox is a huge area where people can get a lot of efficiency.
Okay, then next point, I suppose, is once you've identified an invoice, whether that's coming in via PDF or other formats, is being able to extract the data from that. So again, with the advent, where we see EDI there, you can also think of e-invoicing. They're obviously structured data formats. I would, with the experience we've had with working with e-invoices in multiple jurisdictions, there can be challenges in that we've been operating with e-invoices in the likes of Finland for the last 8 years. And it's amazing the different ways that suppliers submitting their invoices in what should be a universal defined format, they can still put data in unexpected places or presented in unexpected ways. So you want something that is going to extract the data properly from those EDI or e-invoicing messages so that they align properly with what you're looking to validate. And obviously with the paper and PDF, you want to be able to extract the data efficiently from that. And again, Cillian, you and I have been around long enough to see an enormous shift in the ability of technology to extract the data from the invoice. What we started probably doing about 10, 12 years ago with that's faced quite limited results in terms of being able to automatically extract the data. Now you're looking at upper 90s of first-time extraction of the data, which is an enormous reduction in the need for manual capture of the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think the AI capture process is becoming more and more sophisticated. One of the things that we've seen very, very powerful in the last 12, 18 months is capturing invoices in. We have clients there that have locations in China and the Middle East and different countries, and to read it and translate it back to English or to any other language for that matter. And you take all the European languages, it's the success of it. And when you ask some of the people that work for us here that are from those locations, they're saying that the translation is pretty perfect. So that that and that text can come in any format. It can come in EDI, it can come on paper or so having that capability to present an invoice in a different language to you, and then also I think going forward that it's now feeding the next layer of AI in terms of the learning that I can capture it. Now, as soon as I can capture it and determine what it is, I can tell you how I want to process it and pass it to the next part of the process.
Yeah. I mean, that's puts an enormous help to the teams trying to understand what's on the invoice, which might be in a language that's not their own. The next point here was around where you are processing PO invoices. And again, I think it's one small point here, but it can cover a multitude of challenges and therefore opportunities to match. You talked about some of the challenges with goods not being received, with price differences, with product code differences, different structures of POs. There again, we've seen it all. We've seen retail vendors where they're receiving very structured invoices with their SKUs on it, but equally, even within those goods for resale invoices, there's mismatches, there's invalid product codes, there's different units of measure, multiple deliveries against a single purchase order. They all create complexity and manual handling challenges for the AP team. So again, the right AP solution with the right deployment of AI and algorithms can be an enormous step in being able to take what's on the invoice, translate that into what it really relates to with regards to the purchase order and goods receipts that you've done, and validate it and give you an output to indicate whether it's a valid invoice or whether there's a price issue with one line or whether there's an additional charge or whatever on the invoice that wasn't on the purchase order. So again, it's kind of become very much expected with any AP automation solution. We've been doing it for years now, but again, the impact of it can be enormous, and the configuration of it to make sure that it's doing the right validation for you is a key part of it as well.
I think that some of the situations that we've seen there with some clients, and I think that's very common problems, is when an invoice is posted to the ERP on a manual basis. Most ERPs process it initially at a header level, so they will say the invoice validation is the total value of the invoice is 20 grand, and it will go the total value on the PO is 20 grand and the goods receipts are 20 grand. But in the event of it being an issue, and you've talked about there with partial matching, and so it can do a number of things. It can check the product codes are right. So one of the biggest problems in lots of places that the product code on the invoice versus the product code on the PO can be different, and as a result, it's difficult to align what line matches with which. And then following on from that, you can have one line on the PO and 3 lines on an invoice that you can draw down to, or vice versa. 3 lines on a PO that have called out 3 different product lines will get 1 line on an invoice that will say, I've got 3 different consulting days, but you might get one bill for 1,500 or something. So the AI is able to say the 3 of these together equal that on the PO, or various different combinations. So they're all providing more granular assistance, as you say there, to and contextual decision making for the AP team, which we had a client, and I know we talked to case studies there at the end where they had 400 or 500 lines on an invoice in the aviation space, and quite quickly we were able to determine the ones that weren't working very quickly. So those invoices can take up to an hour or two to process. If you can reduce that time from a 2-hour process back to a 10 or 15-minute window, looking at a few exceptions, that's exceptionally powerful for everybody.
Yeah. I think we've all seen AP users using either a real ruler to work their way down a page on an invoice or doing it on screen, and it's an enormous manual undertaking. So being able to automate that, and we'll talk about that in some of our case studies, can transform the time required. Moving beyond POs, I think one thing we've seen is you're getting invoices in that don't necessarily relate to a PO, but there is information that you want to validate that invoice against. And in a manual world, that can be referring back to the contracted daily rate pricing. It could be relating to activity log information. It could relate to stock information that you've stored in a separate system. We've seen all varieties of that. And I think historically, the expectation of the AP team was it's so unstructured, we're not really going to be able to do anything to automatically validate. We're just going to have to take it on the chin and work our way through the invoice and manually look up all the charges against the contract, against the reference documentation we have. That's now been turned on its head, I think, with, first of all, a creative approach to being able to gather that data into somewhere that you can use, and then with the use of AI to be able to compare what's on the invoice to that unstructured data. I think we'll talk about this in the context of some case studies to illustrate that later on, but I think what I would say to any AP manager or finance function looking to who have a challenge around manually validating those types of invoices, if you have the information somewhere, it can probably be used in some form of automation to help validate the invoices when they come in. So it's very much worth exploring what can be done there. Anything to add to that, Cillian?
No, I think that's fair.
Then what you're left with then would be your more traditional non-purchase order invoices. I think there was a point made earlier on or on one of the slides that in most of our customers who do use purchase orders, it tends to be about 10 or 15% of their invoices are non-purchase order. But when you analyze the time required to process those non-purchase order invoices, it's much more than 10 to 15% of the time. They tend to take up much more manual time with the AP team, with whoever needs to code it, with whoever needs to approve it, etc. So again, any information that you may have historically can now be used with AI with LLMs, with the ability to train it based on historical data, or even create rules if you want to put a more specific structure around how your invoices should and can be coded. There's an enormous opportunity to automatically code your non-purchase order invoices in terms of looking at the information on the invoice, comparing that to historical similar invoices and how they were coded. The AI can confidently suggest how they should be coded. It can also determine who it should go to for approval. So again, where the AP team is having to put a lot of effort into doing that, AI can get them a long way to getting that information added to the invoice. And you still have the human in the loop. It doesn't mean things are going to be fully coded and approved automatically. You still want it getting validated, but the amount of time, to your point, Cillian, about reducing the steps and the touch points can be significantly reduced.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned it as an ever-growing problem. I think you said 85% of customers would probably now to admit to having some kind of fraud attempt. I think 85% might admit it, but I suspect it's near 100% now have had some form of attempt to issue a fraudulent invoice or to try to get somebody to change the payment details. It's a huge area of concern for companies to make sure they're when they think they're paying a supplier for something, that they are paying for something they've legitimately received, and also they're paying to the correct account. And that even goes further beyond that, that wherever you're engaging with a supplier or getting an invoice, that it all complies with your own policies, that you've got your correct that you're not paying a vendor who should be providing a PO and they haven't provided a PO on the invoice, that they're billing to the correct organization. So when it comes to audit time, that it looks correct, and that they're not a sanction listed company. That's all things that we can put in place checks for. And then obviously, if somebody does send in a fraudulent invoice or fraudulent prompt to change payment details, that you have the means of detecting that and preventing that going any further in the process. In terms of then getting those invoices out to the business, again, enormous automation there, both AI driven to get them out to the business users automatically with them coded already. So, and also being able to support, I think kind of the last few points probably are extensions of one another, is that get it out to the business user who can do something, who can approve or who can code it. So again, AI and automation can do that. And also giving them comfort and support when they're looking at an invoice, that AI can guide them in terms of how it should be coded. It can do live translations of text on the invoice if needed. It can ensure and validate that it's followed the appropriate company approval policy based on the values and the coding of the invoice. And again, that could be quite dynamic. So there's an enormous area of additional support which helps with faster processing, better user adoption of AP automation if your business users are finding the system gives them the help that they need to do what needs to be done. Cillian, you've been spending a lot of time looking at things like that. Is there anything you've?
Yeah, no, I think as there's probably two areas to that. People are looking for, so the person in AP is the human in the loop, and that's by maybe the AP user or the approver, but they're looking for in-context data around this invoice at any given time and compliance checks. So there's chatbots, and I know we have this in our application, but across many applications, there's chatbots that you can say, should I approve this? Is it in line with compliance policy? Is the vendor bank details okay? Have we paid this invoice? Is this consistent with the behavior? So using the non-PO example we were talking where you're on about, if it was rent or equipment lease, saying this is we're paying the third invoice in March for this year, the amount is consistent, and just giving people context that this all looks above board. There's other simple checks saying this is the first time we're paying this vendor to this bank account. You know, they're little kind of red flags that people might go, okay, hang on, have a look. This is the first time Gareth has signed off this invoice for this thing. It might be there's a change in personnel or whatever. So there's little things that people can start. There's always common behaviors with different things, and I think the one thing, people are getting busier and busier, and the area that people are feeling most vulnerable is when you're busy, because you will rush stuff through. So you make most mistakes when you're under pressure. And what we're trying to do all the time is, even though people are busier, give them more confidence that they're doing the right thing. And AI can assist dramatically with that, so that they're getting the right information at the right time and saying, look, this looks above board, as opposed to somebody saying, can you sign off that invoice? It's delayed, it's not paid. That you're looking to get that point of validation and confirmation and verification with all the contextual information to support you in your decision making of signing off the invoice.
Great. Okay. I think we're just going to talk briefly to a few case studies, and I think what we're looking to give you a sense of here is, just because the information you have is unstructured, or at the moment you're having to spend a lot of time manually coding an invoice, is there are ways that can be significantly reduced now. So the first case study I have up there, they're a telecommunications infrastructure provider. As part of their business, they're engaging with other vendors to provide them with infrastructure components. They don't raise purchase orders for it. They do keep essentially a component record of everything that they've of all of the components that are being provided by third parties, with some pricing information, but there's no PO as such. They receive 3,000 invoices per month, which mightn't sound like a lot, but the typical line count on those invoices is in the hundreds. So they've got hundreds of items, components on those invoices that they then need to cross-reference and validate that it's still an active component that they're using, that the price is correct, that the period for which they've been charged hasn't been charged already. And historically, what they had been doing was working their way one line at a time down the invoice, looking up the component information in their component register, checking the price information. So an enormously manual process, and I think even requiring 1 hour of manual validation is probably an understatement, but the average time per invoice was one hour of validation. What we were able to do in that case was, through integration and through a little bit of just data design, we were able to pull all the information from the different areas they had it, the vendor data from their ERP, the component and billing information from what was actually, in this case, a CRM, and bring that all into our data set, where when an invoice came in, the AI could intelligently cross-reference all the different aspects of what was on the invoice versus what was expected. So while it wasn't necessarily a purchase order in place, it was able to mimic a purchase order type match process to validate each line. And what that has meant is over 80% of those lines on the invoice, the multiple hundreds of lines on the invoice, are now coming in and being automatically validated. So all the AP team have to do is review the 20% of the invoice lines and make sure they're aligned correctly. So it's enormously reduced the manual workload there.
Yep.
Next case study they're a worldwide aircraft operator. They've airplanes flying in and out of airports all around the world. Those airplanes need to be refueled. They have contracts with multiple fuel providers across those airports. They're receiving, again, similar volume of invoices per month. But in this case here, there is no purchase order, but they do have agreed pricing. And they do have information in actually their aircraft operational log system about the fact that fuel was taken on and how much fuel was taken on. So again, a similar manual validation process was required when they were processing these invoices manually. But again, what we've done is been able to collate all of that information into a data set that we can use AI to dynamically validate. So it's a little bit different than with the components, but the end result is that we're able to take what you're being invoiced for, compare it to what you're expected to be charged at a unit price for, and also what you know you have received. So again, similar to a PO type process to a non-PO, bringing a PO type validation and matching to something that is a non-PO process. So again, what we would always look to do is be creative in working with you to leverage whatever information you have to be able to add automation to something that was previously a manual process. Anything to expand on that, Cillian, or did I do that justice in terms of what's been done there?
No, I think that's fine. I think, as you said there, what we're alluding to here across all three case studies, and if you look at the outcomes you have on the right-hand side, is ultimately that the AP function is becoming an exception handling house, and that we're using technology to present and capture and process the good data with AI, using unstructured data in your middle example with the Worldcraft for the contract pricing data and price log. So ultimately that we're looking to maximize some of the opportunity to only make the AP team exception handling houses across the board.
Yeah. And again, this next one here is in the non-PO sphere, being able to leverage historical data to automatically code quite complex invoices based off how historical invoices were coded. So the system, that's again a classic machine learning and AI methodology of it, learning how to code your invoices for you, and again removing that manual process of just adding coding and adding the routing that it can do that. And still, as you said, we keep the human in the loop to review it, but it's removing a lot of that manual data entry part of it. Conscious of time here, I think we might just summarize it at that. I think there's we've hopefully given you a flavor of some of the things that automation and AI deployed correctly can bring you. I think the one thing I would always say is there's a lot of noise out there in terms of what automation can do, what AI can do. It can sometimes be a bit hard to pick your way through. What I would always say is no matter how clever something looks, you have to judge it on the basis of the value that it brings. So if you see a nice feature that looks great, think, well, what does that save me, or how much is it going to cost me to implement it, and what benefit is it going to bring me? And there's a lot out there that will. Equally, there's some out there that look very nice, but actually when you put it under the microscope, you realize it looks nice, but it's not going to bring any value to my business users or to my finance team. It just looks nice. So always have that view to anything you're assessing. Make sure that what you're bringing in gives you value, gives you security, gives you better visibility. Assess it in the exact same way. Just because it's got the AI tag, it still needs to bring the same ROI that anything that you're investing in would need to bring you. Cillian, any nuggets to part with? Or
No, I think, look, we've, as you said, there's an awful lot of noise out there, and there's a lot of opportunity to get sucked into a lot of different scenarios, and you can, to your point, what's the value? I think the other thing that people should consider is, look, if you haven't got AP automation, it's absolutely, one of our clients said, look, it's given her the most kind of bang for buck in terms of an opportunity to deliver efficiency in the finance team. But also, if you're concerned, if you've had a negative experience over the past number of years because there's many stop starts in this, come to the market and try and do a proof of concept or a pilot and get people to utilize it and test it, and be sure that you're sure of the value and you understand how it'll work, and put it through its paces, because there's lots of high level I'm going to call it optics of value, but put the invoices through, give it the scenarios, ramp up the data that you can provide to your supplier, and test it, and be sure that you're sure, because if you capitalize on it, there's huge upside for AP teams. And as you said, focus AP where it matters, prepare for the complexity, and think your way through what you want to do. But I think a pilot will definitely give you huge value back.
Okay, I mean, I think we've just a couple of questions there around the adoption of e-invoicing. I think we've hopefully answered some of that, but to me, it's wherever you're looking. If you are operating in a country where there is an e-invoice mandate in place or coming, that should be part of your evaluation process to make sure that they are going to provide you with a compliant solution in that jurisdiction. Also evaluated on, if you're just receiving a very small volume of invoices, you maybe don't need to go the full connected route there. There's typically lower volume options in each of those jurisdictions. So make sure you're not doing more than needs to be done in those jurisdictions as well, but also make sure that you are going to be able to do whatever you need to do compliantly. Okay, I think we'll probably leave it at that. So thank you very much for your time. We hope you found it of use. We will follow up and touch base with you at a future date, and would love the opportunity to speak to you individually about your particular complexities and challenges, and how we believe we can help you with that. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gareth.